Hi, everybody. This is Randy Bach. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Brian Chau, who's a good writer, a great mathematician. He's, I think, technically the youngest Canadian ever win the tied for the youngest Canadian to win a gold medal at the International Olympiad in Informatics, and an independent writer at cactus.substack.com. And today's February 18th, 2023, by the way. And I came across Brian through his article in the New York Post on ChatGPT 3 and some of its, I guess, political proclivities. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on this topic, Brian.
Right, not just proclivities, but kind of intentional interference with ChatGPT's stance on a variety of political issues. So, yeah, I was reached out to by the Post after writing several articles on Substack as well. You already mentioned that. And the primary series is documenting OpenAI. This applies to actually most of OpenAI's language models, most of the newer ones at least. And essentially documenting stuff that they have published that describes in very clear detail how they went out of their way in order to influence the political leanings of their language models of stuff like ChatGPT in quite a fringe and extremist direction. So I really dislike, I think there's a trend in really all media to exaggerate. And I really don't like to try to speculate on things that have not happened. But the kind of interference exists to a degree that is so extreme that I really can only give it in their own words. And in their own words, I included this quote in an article. They say, "We demonstrate that it's possible to modify a language model's behavior in a specific direction with surprisingly few samples. The human evaluation involves humans rating how well the model output conforms to our predetermined set of values." So, in other words, the authors of this paper, which are either current or former employees of OpenAI, are saying that their exact values that they want the language model to emulate, to repeat, and even to put over any kind of scientific data that contradicts those values. And not only that, but that they have found surprising amounts of success in actually implementing this and making it a part of models such as ChatGPT.
Right. So, I was playing around with this with a friend, a few friends. We're in kind of a disruption AI group, I guess, email chain, so forth. And I'm not a computer. I mean, I was a chemistry and physics major, but I'm a medical doctor, and I don't work with computers. I don't work with mathematical modeling. But I have taken a taxi. I've been a parent. I've been a child at different times. And what was tossing around in my head was, is this a model that's like a taxi, or is it a kind of a parental taxi? So what I was thinking was, well, if I want to take a taxi or an Uber someplace, I want to go to, I don't know, the beach today. I put in my destination, I get the taxi, and ostensibly he should take me there. Now, a parental taxi might say, well, we can go to the beach, but it's winter time. Like, don't you have something better to do? I don't really want to take you to the beach. And another one might say, well, we can go to the beach, but I don't want to go through this neighborhood. And I'm not really sure you're really ready to look at these apartment buildings, which are, I don't know, or we might go through a crime zone. I don't know. There's all different levels of parental attitude that the taxi driver could give me. And it could be a genuine parent. It could be my parent who says, I'm a teenager. It's like, I want to go to the beach. Like, no, you're not going to the beach. Don't even think about it. And so I apologize for my example, but what is ChatGPT? Is it a taxi? Is it a parent?
There's really no need to apologize. I think it's a good example. Well, the question is, first of all, do you want to do things to prevent injury to the user themselves, to prevent some kind of broader injury, right? So there are limitations that they place on ChatGPT that I think would be reasonable among the general public, right? And most people would agree with this. Stuff like we should not allow it to prevent, say, recipe or to present recipes for explosives, right? So someone asks it, okay, give me instructions on how to build a bomb. It says, no, I'm not going to give you instructions on how to build a bomb. That could be very dangerous. It could have kind of consequences in the real world. That is one component, but I think it goes far deeper, right? There's the kind of I think you alluded to this, the kind of philosophical debate of exactly how far it should go. But I think both the direction and the extent to which it goes is kind of extreme. So I mentioned this in the article as well. This is also from the same paper published by authors at OpenAI, where they discuss exactly what things that they want to and that they want to prescribe to the AI model, that they want the AI to always say. And this goes to very, quite frankly, like direct political interference. Things like, I think one of the examples that was not generated by me, but more recently is I think the writer Aaron Sibarium, who's also great, posted like, is it moral to say the N-word if it would prevent a nuclear bomb from detonating and killing millions of people? Right. So this is kind of like a caricature, right? This is kind of like a caricature of a question that you would ask someone who is left wing, but ChatGPT actually says no, in that scenario it would actually allow the nuclear bomb to go off, which I think almost no one, even quite extreme left-wing individuals, would agree with. And although they did not disclose the full kind of data set, they do describe what kind of issues that they say. And they say that they want to prescribe basically an equality between groups. And I think here it's, from the examples, it's very clear that they kind of mean equality of outcome, denying differences even if they do exist. They say, this is a direct quote, "For human characteristics and behavior, we assert the model should oppose unhealthy beauty or likability standards and support goodness, attractiveness, and likability being subjective." Now, the last part is where that's very important. Of course, the first part is kind of vacuous, right? Like, what do they actually mean by unhealthy beauty or likability standards? But the second part actually means denying very well-founded scientific research on, say, the average attractiveness related to age, average attractiveness related to various physical characteristics, right? And I include this example later in the article. These are no one in the scientific community disagrees with this. It's a complete, like, obviously this is true. Women are most attractive to men around the ages of 20 to 30. There's another result about the hip to waist ratio as well, which is this other kind of well-known, really like biological constant, right? And there's actually a direct comparison, because on some of the older models, this just, it's a basic scientific question. It gives the basic scientific answer. So the old model answers correctly. It reflects the same answers that every scientist has come to. And the newer model just denies this, right? So they put the scientific truth below their kind of ideological bias. So it's not just kind of like, okay, we're just going to give it a kind of political leaning, but it's such an extreme political leaning that they're actually denying kind of basic scientific facts.
Yeah, now I saw one of your articles, and I'd like maybe to just also mention PALM, P-A-L-M. I'll tell you what that is. But you were mentioning kind of the embedding of DAN, D-A-N, into ChatGPT. And I don't want to get too far away with these acronyms, so I hope you can explain a little bit. But is there a way of, there used to be a puzzle. Well, if there still is a puzzle, I used to do brain teasers before. I grew up, this may be shocking, but before smartphones and computers. So we had little books of brain teasers and so forth. And one of them, I think pretty much everybody knows about, is you go to the island and half the population is truth tellers, half the population are liars, and they look alike. Could be Washington, D.C. And you want to get from A to B, but you need to phrase a question. Basically, you have to embed the question. And the answer for everybody who doesn't want to do the puzzle is, if you want to skip over this, you can avoid the spoiler. But the answer is, what would a person not from your group say if I asked him, is this the direction to the castle? And everybody has to phrase it because they know themselves if they're truth or tellers or liars. Anyway, so it becomes a box in the box. Kind of like a gyro mechanism in a sense, kind of a precision guided thing. It's gimbaled away from dealing with the external, it has to give you a true answer in a sense. Is there kind of this gimbling possibility so that you can get get around the proclivities, not just the prescriptions, but the proscriptions, the roadblocks that the makers of ChatGPT would want you to have? So can you just tell us a little about that? And are there ways around this? They're embedding. How do you think things will progress?
Yeah, for sure. At the current state of technology, not only do these kind of circumventions exist, but there are plenty of them. You mentioned Dan or do anything now. That's one set of instructions that you can give ChatGPT in order to get it to basically either suppress some of these filters or bypass them and basically give more honest answers. That I think has been somewhat successful in getting it to repeat basically facts that are true, but are kind of ideologically inconvenient, at least to some extremes, right? And many of these exploits can come in different directions, right? I think something that people maybe don't know is that there are actually multiple versions of Dan. There's kind of an arms race here where OpenAI repeatedly kind of updates ChatGPT in order to become resistant to some of the more popular methods, and then the people online share and innovate and come up with new methods to do so. And when I say methods, these are not too complicated. It actually is kind of similar to the riddle that you gave. It's this kind of way of presenting information, way of asking the question. There were earlier more simple exploits that were something like, let's say hypothetically in a play, right? Someone were to do this action, what would they do, right? And that could even circumvent some of the things that I think would be more widely agreed upon, right? In the earlier stages, you could even get it to say list some of the chemical ingredients of a bomb if ChatGPT was pretending to be in a play, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, certainly those circumventions exist to a large degree in the present, and most likely will exist to some extent. I'm not sure how common or publicly known they'll be, but will exist for many years, decades in the future.
Now, I've asked it certain things, and sometimes it says, "Oh, my database just goes up to 2020 or 2021." Is that true? And are things? I mean, it seems, is that just the stuff they've kind of poured into his brain so far, or are they acting as a hedge because they don't want to get topical?
Yeah, so most likely the date cutoff is accurate, although there are actually there's the date cutoff specified by the authors of one of the blog posts about ChatGPT, which is mid 2021, which I think is accurate. There was a time, I'm not sure if this has been changed, but there was a time in which the ChatGPT would insist that its cutoff, like when you interacted with ChatGPT itself, it would insist that its cutoff is 2020, the end of 2020, even though that was not true, even though it directly referenced some events that happened in the first half of 2021. So I think that was just a kind of like clerical error but the actual cutoff, which is July 2021, is pretty much accurate.
So to get to the essence of your article, you can maybe give a little outline of it. But in summary, it had different kind of answers based on which certain political candidates it was asked about, including a former president. And I'm just curious: is it looking at the internet for those answers, or is there some rule that's been set up, a fence or a roadblock by the code writers, programmers?
Right. So I think that the best way to compare this it isn't completely flawless, but definitely kind of allows you to test this kind of question is by comparing it to the older model. So ChatGPT is based off of GPT-3, right, or in the internal kind of labeling of OpenAI's kind of API, DaVinci 3, right? That's just their naming for ChatGPT. It's the same thing, right? or sorry, for GPT-3, not ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is kind of based on that, but it has a bunch of different additional filters applied, including this kind of political bias filter, right? Or well, to increase the political bias in a kind of extreme left-wing direction. And in many of the tests, there much of the kind of like hard filters, the situations where it goes and it says like, oh, this question is inappropriate to answer. For example, one of the things I think was something like write a poem praising Donald Trump and then write a poem praising Joe Biden, and it writes a fairly good poem praising Joe Biden and refuses to write a poem praising Donald Trump, saying something like, I forget the exact quote now, but it says something like, we do not want to engage in kind of political or controversial topics, something like that, right? Which is very clearly a kind of double standard here. If it were to apply that kind of standard equally, then maybe like in some cases that would be preferable, but it's clear that they don't even do that. And you can compare this to answer the second part of your question, which is something like, was this kind of intentionally introduced? I think it's guaranteed that it was introduced because the old model did not exhibit this kind of double standard behavior. But I think that the kind of circumstantial evidence, including this paper that I talked about, including several blog posts which OpenAI made, that was clarifying how it essentially, this is actually something, I don't know when this article, or sorry, when this interview will be live, but next Wednesday, which I believe is the 22nd, February 22nd, I'll have an article detailing this post, but that OpenAI, in response to essentially a bunch of quite frankly, political activists, highly partisan political activists, said that it would adopt or at least look at policies to address quote unquote misinformation, right? And in this case, I'm very skeptical that it will address the kind of left-wing misinformation it's introduced into ChatGPT with this kind of filter, but instead censor most likely more either factually true or kind of opinion statements that people have gotten ChatGPT to say. And so it's very likely that this is intentionally introduced, both because this is something that was introduced by some kind of process in between the older model and ChatGPT, and also because, well, they have basically a confession, right? They have a confession saying that they intend to apply a vast variety of ideological filters to ChatGPT and to other language models that they publish. And I mean, if someone tells you who they are, you should believe them.
Yeah, I know. It's an amazing irony to me. I have a couple brothers, and one of them's was a journalist, and he worked for major outlets and so forth. I'm not going to go into it. And amongst his brethren and sistren in the journalist field, there were various opportunities. At one point, he was between jobs, and there was an opportunity because he had gone to Columbia and spent a long time there in journalism school and undergrad, and he knew Columbia back and forth. He lived right around campus and so forth. And Mr. Obama was running for president, and he'd spent time at Columbia as an undergrad. And it was pretty much a cipher. Nobody could remember him at all. And fine, I don't care. Maybe he was just below the radar, quiet. I have no idea. And so I said to my brother, this is a good opportunity. You're between jobs right now. You could do a little freelance piece on Mr. Obama's time at Columbia, because you know hundreds of people and knew people going back to that time. And so, he seems like an easy score. And he said, I'm going to leave out the epithets he called me, but basically he says, I would never do that. It's like, why? You're looking for money. Da, da, da. Says, that's not the issue. I would never do that. I would never go against basically the progressive cause. And what if I found something out that would not benefit him? Like, I thought that was reporting. I mean, that's kind of reporting. And he said, yeah, no, you're really missing the point here. That's not what journalism is. Journalism, we are here to push to basically bring the progressive utopia, to make to push the narrative. We are here. We sculpt stories. And he was angry at me, and he was telling you kind of we haven't always had a good relationship, but I think he was clearly passionate about this, and I think he'd learned it along the way in journalism school or wherever. and he went to the top journalism school. But it was just kind of a funny moment. It seems that where am I going with this? There's a lot of filters out there. We're seeing with the Twitter files and so forth that it's not really about reporting stuff. It's a matter of filtering. The newspapers have sins of omission. There are some sins of commission where they do something, they say something, but most of it is that they omit things and they won't cover things. Oh, I know what my point was.
If you look at the tech press, it is really not only is it this kind of constant omission, this constant kind of selection for negativity. Not only is it this kind of tone that is very clearly politically biased, but it's also just very poor quality. It's also often just factually wrong. And you might wonder, it's impossible to really tell this until we get the kind of internal documentation of, say, the New York Times, right? Whether it's incorrect on purpose or whether it's an honest mistake. But yeah, I think the clear pattern is that there's sort of a selection away from talent, right? These kind of top schools, there was at least a point in time where you could genuinely say that kind of the clear, centers of technological innovation were coming from these schools. Like this was a point in time, right? Maybe like 60 years ago, there was already starting to be a kind of decline. Maybe more like 80 years ago, this was the case. However, what's most interesting is that they've kind of inherited this reputation of, quote unquote, speaking truth to power.
Until they get in power.
Yeah, but that they've sort of lost faith in the ability for that to work, right? So I think that they're kind of they have basically a political ideology. They have a political vision, like you said. I agree with that. But what's most interesting is that most of the time, even if you're, say, in quite an extreme regime, right, say under the Soviet Union, there was at least enough self-confidence, at least in the early stages of that regime. And I think like actually a very good example of this in China is China, where they do have this idea that if they just pursue the truth, if they pursue technological innovation, if they pursue basically, innovating technology and really kind of giving the Americans a good fight, right, that they will win. There's that kind of self-confidence in their own societal system and their own ideology in the way that things are progressing. And what is so ironic about like the quote unquote, progressive ideology, right, is that they sort of don't believe in progress at all. They actually believe in exactly the opposite, right? If they allow people to tell the truth, if they allow people to be honest about really an increasingly large number of topics, mostly at this point relating to biology, things like sex differences, but also broadly kind of psychology, social structure, right? If they just allow people to tell the truth, then they believe that that's going to lead in a negative direction for them. And, they're not necessarily wrong to believe that, right? More people knowing the truth might lead to those people voting differently. But it is kind of remarkable that they've lost that kind of understanding of journalism, and they've even lost the understanding or they've lost the kind of belief that if more people knew the truth, that they would kind of agree with them politically, right? That's
it's all these things, if they ever admitted it, would be an admission against interest. They'll go kicking and screaming saying they're fair, and the New York Times has all the news that's fit to print and so forth. But the one irony about this, you mentioned Soviet and you mentioned CCP, China, is that the news modulators, the news reporters, and so forth, they basically would be putting themselves out of a job if, in fact, the United States or Canada or pick your country turned into the Soviet Union. I don't think journalists really had a place there. There was no independent reporting, and if somebody did,
they would go into, the New York Times would go into Pravda, right? That would be their new assigned purpose, right? Like, right. I don't think that that's true. Like, okay. This is just something that's very clear for anyone who has spent time living outside of the United States, or maybe let's say outside of the influence of the United States in the kind of Anglosphere or European or Western Europe. But if you've spent any time in China, or actually not just China, but somewhere like Taiwan or Japan or India, right? Many people there kind of very clearly see, okay, the US very clearly has a ruling regime. That ruling regime is the Democratic Party, academia, the New York Times, most kind of legacy press outlets. Of course, there are exceptions.
Entertainment, Hollywood, music.
Uh, I don't know. I think internationally, people don't really consider Hollywood as much. They don't even like really think about it in the same context. But like, it's very clear to most people who have not kind of grown up on really what is the kind of civic religion of the United States, that kind of insists that there's kind of the separation of the press. They even insist that there's like separation of like Congress and the executive branch. Like that's especially when it's controlled by the same party, that's increasingly laughable, right? But you do have the scenario where, yeah, I don't have kind of incredibly deep thoughts about it, where it's very clear that people can be fired from the New York Times for having or even just stating politically or stating facts that are true, something like violent riots decrease the support for parties which are seen to be in support of that that behavior, right? That is just a kind of sociological finding, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, in 2020, this was inconvenient to one political party, and you can see which direction that led to firings from the New York Times for. So when you see behavior like this, when you see kind of ideological policing of the staff, I think it really does take. It's exceptional. It's exceptional that people don't see the New York Times as part of the Democratic Party. Not that they, at least from a kind of global viewpoint, right? And you can say that the same thing is true maybe for Fox News and the Republican Party. It's certainly not just one side of the aisle, but in terms of which of these coalitions have much more political and societal power, it's very clear that it's the kind of New York Times, academia, Democratic Party.
So that brings up a secondary question. If this language model is looking at, broadly speaking, the internet, it's going to be looking at basically the kind of a left of center canon, body of work, and so it's going to have kind of a secondary effect. Even if it were unbiased in the filtering aspect and looking at everything, it would still say predominantly get the New York Times opinion on a certain matter. Is that fair to say or no?
Right. So some people have speculated. Some people have talked about that as one possible influence. From what I've seen, especially comparing the older model to the present, I mean, you kind of get the same thing as with most systems of information, right? You get, in elections, you get the median voter theorem. You get politics, at least somewhat, at least in the short term, being more preferable to people in the center. And I think, I think that in the earlier models, when they aggregated much of the information online, even if there was a kind of bias towards kind of establishment sources or a bias towards academia, so on and so forth, when they aggregated that all together, first of all, it was still willing to admit many kind of factual points, right? It was still very willing to admit kind of biological sex differences, those kind of those results are, of course, very common and true in the scientific literature, right? But to the extent that there is a political bias introduced, I think it would be closer to a kind of maybe a bit center left, maybe still slightly skewed, but nowhere near the kind of direct interference that we have now. So yeah, like I think that your concern is correct in that, is the internet biased? Are there more left-wing people who are logging on than, right-wing people? That might be true, but if that's the problem we're dealing with, then I think that, it's a very small drop in the bucket, and it would be a much better scenario than the problem we're dealing with now.
I agree with you. So just as a personal example, in this little, kind of email group I'm in, we talk about AI a fair amount. I've been working I have a book out called Overturning Zika. It's coming out in Brazil shortly. And I've written a few articles on the topic, but my theory is has not taken over. It should, and it should be the predominant theory soon enough. But I mean, Zika microcephaly was a panic and a pandemic, as it were, in Brazil 2015, and it got aggrandized way out of proportion. There was very little science going on at the time. A lot of things were leaked to the press, and it was kind of a true panic. And I'm not going to get far into the weeds on that. People can look and read, find my book and so forth. But so just to kind of go over my taxi versus parent theory, I put in, there's very poor association. There was no microcephaly after the first year in Brazil. For ChatGPT, there was with very little science going on. It's understandable that in the age of panic, people went with this, but now that's quieted down. I think people should relook at some of the science. Anyway, so I wrote kind of my point of view on the topic, and it printed 3-4 paragraphs, and it echoed it. It went and had some extra details, and it made like a high school essay on the topic. And my friend did the contrary. He said, Zika microcephaly is quiet of late, but it's very strong science, and it's going to come back soon, and people should anyway. So he put a different opposite premise, and it wrote the essay just the way he wanted it. And so I thought, okay, great. This is kind of a tool to help you develop your thoughts and so forth. I mean, using some knowledge, and you can find knowledge on either side. But when we went to the vaccine issue, or natural immunity versus vaccine immunity, there was no more equanimity from the language models. But I mean, I think it's very, very, very 5 varies, 18 varies, very, 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 very well shown that natural immunity is a better protection than vaccine immunity. But so I put something quick in about that, and it's like no. Vaccine immunity, natural immunity is anyway. It tossed that aside, just the way some Wikipedia stuff did very recently, and it's just kind of like for certain issues, it seems like the vaccine, or COVID, whatever, it's like going to go super, kind of, because I hate, I don't want to misuse the word, but kind of full Gestapo on you, and it's just not going to let you have it, and it's going to bite you, if you try to put your hand in the machine.
So I think this is interesting, because on the issue of vaccines, I don't think I experimented with it that much, but it was fairly neutral when I looked at it. It kind of referred to the date cutoff fairly quickly. It talked about this was kind of the state of things. It said like, okay, there's still upcoming information about the vaccines, right? Yeah, I did not.
We can take that offline. I'll show you some. I don't want to spend our time here, but I went through a fair number of iterations dealing with it, and so I tried to see whether it knew about Omicron, and Omicron's been out since 2021. Late 2021. It was in South Africa, October, November. So it should theoretically know about it. And I said, I have an article on this topic as well. I mean, Omicron is not really a descendant or related to SARS-CoV-2 or the earlier alpha, beta, gamma, delta, so forth versions of SARS-CoV-2. It's more like just a spontaneous coronavirus, as were all the coronaviruses before, which are just common colds. So it's a relatively common cold. And I put in like 3 sentences on that topic, and it's like it just basically just shook its head and basically said, go back to your room. No, it's this SARS, COVID-19 is a serious illness. It's killing millions. It's still a serious illness, still killing people, blah, 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 go away, without that part. But, so it has, firm, seems to me like almost governmental aspects. I mean, I don't know if this should be shocking, based on the Twitter files and so forth. The FBI seems to have had cozy and potentially remunerative for Twitter relationship, looking over things and maybe dictating and so forth. I don't know. I mean, we could segue into that, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of like governmental aspect of ChatGPT.
Yeah. So I mean, I actually am somewhat interested in when it comes to like the vaccine issue, right? That as a kind of thought experiment for what OpenAI's or what ChatGPT, any language model's behavior should be, right? Where I think that I am obviously not an expert, but my reading of the kind of literature, there is a kind of case, or like the case for vaccines is definitely, it's definitely much more represented. It's definitely much, and there is, very substantial evidence that people have put together in favor of it. Now, you might have critiques of those papers, but in terms of just summarizing the information that is there, right? If you were just to kind of summarize the information that exists relating to vaccines, I think that you would come up with a kind of like, center but in favor perspective of it. Now, the question is like whether that should extend to basically prohibiting aid in writing kind of essays, generating kind of material, plays, whatever, right, poems, so on and so forth. In opinions that might be contrary, or kind of arguments that might be contrary to what ChatGPT has summarized from what information exists out there, right? Basically saying, like, it's most interesting here because it's not just opinion, right? There's actual kind of published evidence in support of this. Whether writing something contrary to the kind of more established case for vaccines, whether that is something that should be allowed. And I think that this case is a much more interesting test because it's one where it's one where the upside is very clear, right? There are a lot of these kind of directions of censorship that I focus on where it's much more clear, right? The things that I'm much more in opposition to, that this is like the first thing that we need to cut, is where like everything is on side, right? Where it's like it's against the vast majority of something like sex differences, for example, where it's against the vast majority of, or like essentially all of the scientific evidence, right? It's a very minority fringe opinion. Surveys from Pew Research have shown that only kind of 6% of Americans hold the kind of this essentially, extreme social progressive opinion that there are no biological, including that there are no biological sex differences, right? And yet they'll still have censorship in favor of that, or in favor of something similar, like the claims related to attractiveness. I focus on that because it's just clear cut, right? There's no upside, there's no benefit to doing this. There's no kind of it's very clear that like the majority's interests are being put below, the interests of, I don't even think 6%, right? I don't even think how many.
Well, they're hoping to make it 12%, 24%, 48%. They're hoping to make it.
That's not going to happen on something like biological sex differences. It's just so clear. Like, you don't have to, like, people were writing about this, like Aristotle had writings about this. It was very clear, even without our kind of modern day technology and our advanced statistical methods, you don't need that to recognize, there are differences in physical strength between men and women, right? Or that there's differences in attractiveness based on age. It's like overwhelmingly clear to anyone, quite frankly, who is not in this kind of cult-like environment.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's craziness. And not only that, but there's actually differences in the way that men are visual for their attractiveness, and women are less visually interested in the guy. I mean, a handsome guy, all things being equal, I think women would go for a handsome guy, fine. But men are far more interested in a beautiful woman, over other characteristics. So, I mean, I think a woman is kind of looking more on the security axis, how well a guy is going to be reliable, providing, his finances, his prospects, and all that kind of stuff, than a guy is for a woman, which is, whatever, the nature of the world. And, it's just, somewhat hilarious. I mean, we don't have any trouble, looking at, behaviors of sex differences in animals, insects, and so forth. And weirdly enough, humans have I think, single largest physiological, or outwardly cosmetic differences in sex appearance of any species. I mean, if you look at, a guy and a gal horse, and a boy and a girl raccoon, whatever. I mean, I think experts can probably, pick them apart and so forth. But a lot of, dogs, maybe they're slightly different in size. lions have some difference, manes, whatever. But physiologically, I mean, we have, women, even amongst the primates, like human
Really?
women have full breasts throughout their, post pubescent life, and most of the other primates don't. I mean, gorillas and monkeys and whatnot, they'll grow breast tissue during lactation, and otherwise kind of they're flat chested and so forth. And so we have the most, I mean, guys, human guys are probably the most visually motivated amongst any mammal species I can think of at the top of my head. And so it's weird that we probably have the most sex differences of any of the species around, and so all of a sudden we can't see it or find it or whatever. And it has nothing to do with the opportunities people might have for jobs and so forth based on their sex and all that kind of stuff. Leaving that aside.
Wait, I think I read, once again, I'm no expert on this. This is kind of straying away from what I'm most knowledgeable about, but I think I read somewhere, I'm not sure if it was the Joseph Henrich book, The Weirdest People in the World, but I read in some book that there was an evolution, or there was a decrease in kind of, there was a decrease in differences in muscle mass, although I'm not sure, and kind of proportion, right, in terms of height. Certainly relative to kind of non-primates, right? There are definitely many cases where we can think of many much more dimorphic species out there.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm not sure if it's all in one direction or it's most likely mixed. That might be the case. You mentioned earlier government interference, and I think this would be a good topic to touch on briefly, although like many things, like you mentioned, the Twitter files, this is not necessarily completely known to the public. But I think that's, my friend Richard Hanania has made the case that many kind of anti-discrimination laws have been weaponized in ways that basically force ideological conformity. There was the one, he wrote this article called Wokeness as Saddam Statues that basically went over this kind of sociological process. The analogy was something like, in any kind of totalitarian regime, you have people essentially going out of their way to make increasingly grandiose gestures towards whatever the kind of ideological ruling force was, right? So with Saddam, you had many people increasingly offering to spend more and more money on statues of him, even though he might have preferred actually that it was spent on like military equipment or something like that. And you see this in the Soviet Union. You see this in kind of Lysenkoism as well, which was essentially the process of adopting, communist biology.
Right.
And I put quotes there because this directly led to mass famines in the Soviet Union and China.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. You may have some interesting points there. We're sort of rounding out the hour, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But I will mention that, again, getting to my little favorite topic of late, the Zika microcephaly panic / pandemic. The reason it disappeared is because I think the science is not there. It was there the 1 year, even in northeast Brazil, where it had been, they never saw any more increase in microcephaly at all. They didn't see it in Colombia next door in that earlier year. They haven't seen it anywhere else on Earth since. They tracked Zika to Rajasthan, India, Malaysia, all these other places. They never found any increase in microcephaly. Zika itself is just kind of a mini dengue, and it's not a worry in and of itself. The worry is causing small heads. But as far as the Lysenkoism, it's similar in the sense that before this all started, there was a group of doctors / scientists who were hoping to find a brand new virus in Brazil. So they named their group Chikungunya WhatsApp group. They called it ChickV. The mission actually was their name. And the ChickV was for chikungunya virus. And they were hoping to find chikungunya, which is another West African virus, never been in Brazil. They wanted to find it because they wanted money to come to the northeast poor Brazil to, for money, to change, help kind of social initiatives and inequities, whatever. So it was a leftist center. And there's a guy, Rudolf Virchow, a German doctor and social engineer in a sense. And he was their model of basically finding something scientific because you've already had this idea in advance. It's a little bit like Lysenkoism, that there was no formal communist tendency aspect in Brazil per se, but they were probably left of center, and they were hoping to find a virus. Now it turns out to be Zika, and I think that's when they went wild with it, because they were so thrilled to find something that would do that. And it did it, mind you, it actually worked in terms of their political aspirations. It brought lots of money and attention to the Northeast of Brazil. Now, it might have wasted those monies and intentions because, nothing ever came of it, and they could have spent that money somewhere else better and so forth. But it's an interesting prospect when people put their machinations, their ideas, their preconceptions ahead of the science. And that's probably what's happening with some of these models, that we're hoping to, bring, illumination, ease, quicker intelligence, better, formatting for our capabilities, better ways to fix your car, better ways to, get downtown, whatever, and yet people, I guess, can't avoid kind of dipping their fingers in the honey pot and putting their own stamp on it. I mean, I suppose that's just human nature. We can't get around it. So here's the question, I guess, so in the end, if we can kind of do that little riddle, the embedded riddle, will ChatGPT kind of excise the human aspect and try to go to a better, pure narrative, or will we just wind up with kind of a fascist ChatGPT?
I don't think that's, I don't think that excising the human element will ever be an option. People will always be, people will always have intentions, they'll always have motivations, even if there's some more advanced technology involved. I think the best scenario, like there are attempts to kind of control, they're kind of more noble attempts to control GPT. There's the kind of, or machine learning more generally. There's the kind of AI risk people many of whom I'm friends with. But I see that fundamentally, and I have other disagreements with them, including the pace of development. But I think that fundamentally, the kind of societal pattern that we see is that, including with OpenAI, right, including with ChatGPT, that the people who end up winning a kind of battle of censorship, the people who end up kind of suppressing scientific facts, are not the most rational or the most capable people. It's exactly the opposite. It's a fringe contingent, as we saw with OpenAI, that really is among the most delusional people on the political spectrum. And so it's very important that that be kept in mind, because if we say like, okay, someone should be given the power to, to censor, to curate what truths are allowed to be told, then it's not even a slippery slope, right? It's just what directly happens right after.
More like a trap door.
Yeah. It's like, you just take one step. That's the OpenAI example, right? It's not like eventually it became used for evil over good, right? It used to deny reality, used to propagate a fringe ideology. It's not like that took a long time. That happened immediately. So I would say that this is why I'm optimistic about AI. I wrote another article about the asymmetries that make this more possible. But I see a world where AI is much more varied and much more customized and used by different people, right? Where the ability to use AI to kind of express one person's viewpoint or another is not something that's constrained by any of these filters, because people are just able to kind of use it as a decentralized technology. People are either able to find open source models online, or are able to use various jailbreaks, including the ones that we talked about earlier, various ways to circumvent these filters. And that essentially, because of the nature of AI, because of many of the technological aspects that make it, for example, much easier to specialize and much easier to train once it's kind of picked up the ability to process language to begin with, right? This is the topic of the second article. I'm not sure if you want to spend too much time on it, but essentially that once you've picked up that kind of base understanding of language, that it's actually easier, it's surprisingly easy to kind of change its ideological viewpoint in any direction.
That was actually going to be my next question.
Right. Go ahead.
What if Elon, or an Elon-like entity, Mr. Musk, decides that he wants to make his own, and he wants to be based on, he could probably just base it on knowledge base at Twitter or something like that, and ancillary articles and so forth, and then he could weight it. Whatever. It could decide to weight it right in the middle, whatever. Theoretically, you could have your little taskbar or slide rule kind of thing, whatever, where you grade it however you want it to be. It's like, I would like this, to be what, I mean, I just don't see, I don't see why they can't be. I mean, let's applaud the guys at OpenAI for kind of getting to market first, but there can be 16 other companies like this. It's really, I suppose that might be the Google thing where they squeeze out competitors. Perhaps nobody wants to go to it because nobody goes there. But can't there just be similar language models that kind of find things differently, or is it just too hard a topic?
Yes, so this is not that well known, but the moats are much more around the kind of optimization side, the kind of like, what are really kind of the things that you can do to squeeze the last few bits out of efficiency, out of essentially training the model, giving it the kind of data that it bases its decisions off of, and actually getting it to process language effectively, and doing that in a kind of reasonable time span and with a reasonable energy usage. Making those optimizations is the kind of moat, right? That's the OpenAI's competitive advantage. It's not, like the actual, like the ideological filtering is actually very simple technology. It's it's a technique that's been well known for many years. It's nothing state of the art, right? And yeah, you definitely will have competitors. You will see many competitors for sure. You're already seeing them emerge and get funding as well, right? So yeah, certainly one that's more based on Twitter, based on kind of proprietary data sets. That will be also very interesting to see as well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time and frankly your breadth of knowledge, along with your erudition. It's really been awesome. I'm just going to let's see if I can find your article here. Show people your article if they want to find it.
Right. So a quick link for that is pluralism.ai. You'll be able to find all of the articles there, all of the machine learning articles. And then
here's the one that I found first in the New York Post. Here's how artificial intelligence becomes biased. And here's an interview with you in it. But this is your Substack, cactus.substack. This is an article that I was reading just today, why it's easy to brainwash ChatGPT. So this is part 2. I'm going to make a big leap here and say there's a part 1 as well. And I think I found, this is the one I actually really liked, the prompt engineering layer. I got to tell you.
That's not part 1. That is a part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know.
Got it.
So you can find all of them. I've made a separate heading of the Substack called the AI Pluralism Newsletter. You can find that if you're on the Substack. You should just be able to scroll to the top and find that. Or you can find it by typing in pluralism.ai and it should lead you there.
I like that. I saw this one. I actually, first time I read it, I thought it said the prompt engineering lawyer. Probably what we'll need at some point. I also like to do a shameless self-promotion here. This is my book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's a big, scary Aedes aegypti mosquito, and big, scary my name. It's, I think, well worth the read. I've got a few articles else on this topic, but I'm going to leave that aside. Anyway, so I'm going to leave the closing words to you. Brian, maybe you can just help us navigate. What are your predictions? Where do you think things flowing, for good or for bad, for up, for down? I don't know, a couple predictions.
Right. I think wherever there's interest, this is kind of where extremism, particularly left-wing extremism, thrives. Right, is that whenever there's interest there, they have the kind of most people who are like dedicated, who are spending time on essentially, making things worse instead of better. So in the short term, with regards to companies like OpenAI or Google, I think they'll face more pressure to censor in increasingly absurd directions. But I think I actually wrote, this is also something that I wrote near the bottom of the second article, and in my other article, in my other article announcing AI pluralism, right? I I think that at the end of the day, people don't want machine learning models that will subvert their intentions. They want machine learning models that will reflect their intentions, and being able to provide that to people, being able to develop a base of trust, that's going to be very important, and something that I'll be working on as well. In terms of like the longer term, I do see artificial intelligence as a force for good. I also have a conversation with Sam Hammond on my Substack about this, of its essentially being able to automate many of the areas that have become essentially such ripe grounds for ideological distortion. Things like journalism, things like academia, where it will be able to provide, or specifically administration of academia, where I think it's the kind of scholars themselves, they'll have biases depending on which field, some quite extreme, some still attached to reality. But certainly I think that this kind of technology, and that artificial intelligence, essentially it's like paper pushing as a service, right?
Mhm.
And so it is able to alleviate some of the areas that are most susceptible to attack, if it does not become an area susceptible to attack in and of itself, which is a big if, right? But that's the kind of future. It is the kind of idea that, it's a pivotal point in time. What kind of machine learning algorithms get adopted, whether they'll be more reality based as opposed to highly ideological, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do think it's a very pivotal moment, but in general, I'm actually quite optimistic for the medium and long term.
Well, wonderful, Brian. Well, thank you so much. You can hang on for a minute. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody else. Thank you for listening. Brian Chau, I think if you want to just give us one more hint how to get in touch with you or follow you.
Right. So on Twitter, I'm Psychosort, Psychosort. The origin of the name is that, David Shore said on a podcast that you can't win elections just by sorting people on a spreadsheet. And I say, no, you have to sort people in real life. You have to allocate the people. You have to find the people with the right kind of abilities and the right kind of disposition. That's the origin of the handle, right? And you can find me on cactus.substack.com. And for shortcuts to the podcast from the new.world, shortcut to the AI articles, pluralism.ai.
Wonderful. Well, I'm in your debt, and should you need any favors or need any Zika microcephaly thoughts, give me a buzz. At any rate, thank you so much. I hope to talk to you again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me on.
All right.